It's been taken over by AI.
Good evening. 안녕하세요. It's so nice to see everybody. I'm Suzanne Crowder-Hahn, the Vice President of the Royal Asiatic Society of Korea, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight. We welcome friends and members here in Seoul, as well as people who are attending via Zoom, people from all over the world who are attending. So welcome to everyone. The RAS Korea is sincerely grateful to the Asia Development Foundation for its continued financial support, which we need very badly. We also thank our member Yujång from the TCS Tour Lab for helping us with this venue for our lecture. She's not here tonight. If she was here, I would ask everybody to give her a big round of applause because she's really done a great thing for us to arrange this lecture venue. Please be reminded that lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of the Royal Asiatic Society of Korea. Tonight, we have lecture number 1512, and we will be hearing from noted Korean literature translator Bruce Fulton about the Penguin Book of Korean Short Stories, which he edited. The literary review described the collection as an ever-surprising and stylistically diverse anthology that will surely stand as the touchstone collection of Korean literature to come. Bruce has a BA in philosophy from Bowdoin College, an MA in Korean Regional Studies from the University of Washington, and a PhD in modern Korean literature from Seoul National University. He is currently at the University of British Columbia, where he occupies the Young Bin Min Chair in Korean Literature and Literary Translation, and teaches courses in modern Korean literature, as well as courses in Korean to English literary translation. Bruce's affiliation with Korea goes back to the late 1970s when, like me, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer right here in Korea. It was at that time he met his wife, Chu-chan, with whom he almost always worked on translation. And she is sitting right back there. Thank you. We are very honored to have with us Mr. Kwon Young-min, who wrote the introduction to the book. And we're also very honored to have with us the author Jung-hee, whose story makes sense. Now, without further ado, let's give a big round of applause for Bruce.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. It's wonderful. I like to think that there is a lot of inyan to my life. And some of you, probably a lot of you have heard this before, but I was born on Hangulao. So every once in a while, my students will wonder, what's an old white guy doing teaching Korean literature? Well, the answer is inyan. I was born on October 9th, the day that the great King Sejong in 1446 promulgated or officially announced the creation of Hangul to the people of Chosun. So welcome, thank you all of you for coming. I'd like to also welcome those of you who are attending by Zoom and 한국이 여러분 바쁘신 중에 와주셔서 감사드립니다. I'd like to start out. I've got quite a bit of insamao, so please be patient. I'd like to start off by acknowledging, I believe this is the first time I've spoken to the Royal Asiatic Society, but it's worth mentioning that some 10 years ago, my colleague Ross King and I at the University of British Columbia initiated a series of publications of edited volumes of the translations of James Scarth Gale, whom I understand is one of the founders of the Korea branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, and who was the very first Canadian missionary to here to Korea. But in hearing this, please don't assume that I'm Canadian. I'm not. I'm American, and proud of it. I also take pleasure in acknowledging other writers or translators in the audience. And in addition to Ms. O, we have Chae-yoon, former professor of French literature at Sodan University, a scholar, received her PhD at Provence University in France with a dissertation on Marguerite Duras, and also a very good translator of Korean literature into French. I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Kim Tae-yong in the back, who the author of the Pig on Grass story in the anthology, and someone whose works we have taken great pleasure in translating. Next, I'd like to tell you how this anthology came about. As I've mentioned in the editorial note, there are quite a few anthologies of modern Korean fiction available. So the obvious question is, why did we think it necessary? We, meaning Kevin O'Rourke. The late Kevin O'Rourke and I have been talking about this anthology for a number of years, as in my case, as a scholar, or not a scholar, I don't consider myself a scholar, I'm a teacher, but I assign translations of Korean literature in my courses, and I have quite a few, one of which I co-edited with Professor Gwon. But Kevin O'Rourke and I decided that instead of the usual criteria for selecting the works that will appear in an anthology, we decided to focus on the stories we really loved. Stories that in some cases compelled us to translate them, but stories that we believe succeed as English language works of literature that we believe will survive, stand the test of time. Unfortunately, shortly before we went into contract with Penguin UK, Kevin O'Rourke suffered the cerebral aneurysm from which he never woke up. And so I was unable to add his name to the byline, but I regard him as the spiritual co-editor of the volume. So how did this anthology come about? How do we get it into print at a time when, if one does not work with a literary agent, and I will try my best not to devolve into a rant about literary agents, Yujång and I came across a book launch for the Penguin book of Korean short stories, which came out about 6 or 7 years ago at the University of Washington. Oh, okay. Thank you. The Penguin book of Japanese short stories. So we attended, and the editor of that volume, Jay Rubin, is someone we've met a few times, and he was kind enough to introduce us to his editor at Penguin UK, who in turn recommended Jessica Harrison, who is the editor of the volume. And I'd like to acknowledge among the translators 2 mentors that were very, very important to my development as a person, as a teacher, as a translator. The first is Kim Jong-un, who taught Jewish American literature at Seoul National University. He and I became close in the 1982-1983 academic year when he was a visiting professor at the University of Washington. And I remember this was the time when I was completing my MA program in Korea Regional Studies at the Jackson School of International Studies at the UW. And I remember taking all three of the courses he taught. UW is on a quarter system. And in the fall quarter, he taught in Korean stories from the colonial period. In winter quarter, he taught stories in translation. And in spring quarter, he taught in Korean stories from post-liberation. And we kept in touch, and we decided later in the 1980s that we enjoyed the colonial period stories so much, we would put together an anthology, which became A Ready-Made Life, Early Masters of Modern Korean Fiction, published in the late 1980s, I think, early 1990s, by the University Press of Hawaii. I also want to mention the late, great Marshall Peale, whom I first met. We first met at Harvard about 40 years ago. Marshall was very kind. He offered us a lot of support. I remember when he saw the first of our three translations that earned a Korea Times Translation Award, he wrote a bit of an essay, and I think he said, no more vanilla something or other. But he was very, very kind. He was very supportive. And he invited us to collaborate with him on the fiction volume of a 4-volume anthology of post-liberation literature edited by Professor Kwon, called Haebang Hu Sashimyane Munak. And that became the anthology Words of Farewell, which was published in 1993. And that became a fixture in the literature classrooms and was published in a revised and expanded edition. We're unfortunate to lose Marshall in 1995, but Marshall was also an ongoing mentor and someone whose memory remains dear to us. Among the other translators, I'd like to acknowledge a couple of my students at the University of British Columbia. And is Saji Moon Sensing in here? Saji Moon Sensing, formerly a professor of English literature at Koryo University, translated the story by Lee Moon-yeol in here, The Old Hatter, Sarajinga Turuwihayo. And speaking of authors, in the back in the corner there, I'd like to acknowledge Walter Liu. Walter, could you stand up, please? An early scholar of Isong, creative writer of his own, a specialist in Asian, Korean American literature. And finally, let me pay special attention to three very important people. I've already mentioned Kevin O'Rourke. Kevin O'Rourke was an Irish Columban priest who arrived in Korea in the 1960s. And by the early 1970s, he had translated enough stories to complete one of the very first volumes of English translations of Korean short fiction. But Kevin's specialty was poetry. And one of his enduring goals was to cover the entire Korean poetic tradition, dating back from Hyanga to the present era. And I continue to assign his volumes to my courses in Kojan Munak. And if you find his book of Korean poetry, poems from Shilla and Koryo, you will see on the back of that volume an endorsement by myself in which I recognize Kevin for bringing to us the heart and soul, in my opinion, of the Korean literary tradition, shiga. That is vernacular poetry. So Kevin was a constant companion. I like to remind people the first time I met him, I think it was 1993. We were at a place that sold Budweiser beer by the can, and he said, "Okay, here's what I want you to do." And he gave me a book of his stories. Said, "Review this, get it published." So that was the start, but it was a wonderful relationship. And of course, I want to echo Suzanne in acknowledging my good wife, Yujång Fulton, life companion, co-translator for almost 45 years now, and a source of ongoing support at a time when I begin to forget things like saying the Korean Penguin Book of Korean Short Stories instead of the Japanese Penguin Book of Japanese Stories. And finally, I wish to thank Professor Gwon. Professor Gwon, I also met about 40 years ago after Marshall Peel, who was teaching at the University of Hawaii at the time, passed away rather suddenly in 1995. He urged me to return to academia, saying that with a degree I could become more active, and he was right. But he has supported me in a number of ways. He was my Jido Kyosunim in my PhD program at Seoul National University, where I wrote a dissertation on the short fiction of Hwang Chini. He has since been a constant companion in terms of bridging Korea and North America. For a number of years, we had almost annual workshops that included an opportunity for junior scholars and PhD students to make academic presentations. And he has done more than anyone else here in Korea to connect the Korean literary tradition with other parts of the world: Vietnam, Republic of China, India, North America. So it was so fortunate that we were able to enlist him to write the introduction to this anthology. And one of the very first reviews we got from the United Kingdom, where the hardback edition was published at the end of April of last year. One of the very first reviews mentioned how engaging the reviewer found Professor Gwon's introduction. So Professor Gwon has kindly offered to say a very short greeting, and I will turn the microphone over to him. Hong Såkchung. 여기 있습니다.
번역님 한국말로 몇 마디만 하겠습니다. 오늘 이렇게 많이 와주셔서 고맙고요. 한 가지만 얘기하고 싶은 건 불턴 교수가 펭귄북 시리즈의 한국 단편 소설 선집을 간행할 수 있는 가능성이 생겼다고 했을 때 엄청나게 흥분했습니다. 왜냐하면 대학 시절부터 세계의 유명한 클래식을 영어를 읽는데 텍스트북이 전부 펭귄북이었기 때문입니다. 1990년대 초에 프린스턴 대학에서 나온 출판부에서 나온 프린스턴 시학 사전이라고 하는 공부하는 사람들이 보는 책인데 거기에 처음으로 한국 문학에 관련된 항목이 들어갔어요. 그게 뭐였냐면 한국의 전통 시가인 시조였습니다. 그걸 보고 제가 이제 전문가들이 한국 시조에 대해서 이제 관심 있는 사람이 알아볼 수 있겠다 생각을 했는데 이 펭귄북의 한국 단편 소설들이 들어가는 것은 영어의 본고장에서 한국 문학이 이제 작은 틀을 하나 잡았다 이런 생각이 했던 것이죠. 그래서 굉장히 흥분했고 수없이 만나고 편지하고 제가 버클리 있었기 때문에 같이 계획을 세우고 최대한 도우려고 했습니다. 한 가지 꼭 밝히고 싶은 것은 당초에 이 책에 들어갈 그런 계획으로 되어 있던 작품과 작가들이 있었는데 어떤 여인인지 알 수 없습니다만 그 에이전 노하고 이 속에 들어가는 것을 거부 작가는 아무 대답도 하지 않은 사람들이 있었어요. 그래서 너무 안타까웠습니다. 왜 이런 일이 생겼을까? 이 사람들이 도대체 한국 문학을 세계에 알릴 수 있는 아주 중요한 기회를 왜 이렇게 박차하는가 하고 안타까운 적이 있었습니다. 근데 제가 개인적으로 분들한테 이거 해야 된다고 원하지는 않았습니다. 그거 하나가 당초에 이 시리즈를 계획했을 때하고 조금 달라지는 것. 그게 하나 유감이지만 그래도 이렇게 멋진 책이 펭귄북 시리즈에 들어갈 수 있게 된 것은 한국 문학을 공부하는 사람으로 참으로 반가운 일이라고 생각합니다. 모든 그 공로는 사실은 우리 풀턴 교수에게 있습니다. 풀턴 교수를 위해서 한 분만 여러분들 박수 해주시면
Well, it is such an honor to be recognized by the man who has done more than anything else to bring Korean literature to the attention of the outside world. I could probably spend about 15 minutes simply talking about all the publications, encyclopedic publications, complete works of Isang, complete works of Kim Jong-in. And I should mention, and this is a beautiful, beautiful set, a series of Shinsoso that includes not only modern spellings of the stories, but also facsimile reproductions of how these stories first appeared in the Mail Shinbo and other newspapers more than 100 years ago. And of course, the usual scholarly apparatus. But these are beautifully, beautifully designed books that fill a vacuum because we really don't have much in the way of Chadio reference works on Shinsos. So anyway, in acknowledging authors, I believe we have Yujång back. I'm sorry, I didn't see you earlier. Yujång, I made a special point of inviting her to this presentation because of an English language novel she wrote that is based on the Seoul tragedy of about 10 years ago. And it's a novel that I assigned to my Literature of the Korean Diaspora course at UBC seminar course. And at the end of my seminar courses, I always ask my students to complete a text evaluation form so that I have an idea of how well or not well the assigned works are engaging the students. And I'm proud to say that Unni, the title of the novel by Yujång, was in first place, the most engaging work of the 11 that I assigned. So Yujång has brought copies of the book, which she will be happy to distribute after at the conclusion of this event. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the stories themselves, and about 2/3 of the way through the volume, we have a story, a classic story by Mizo Sulejai Nore, Wayfarer in our translation, and we've decided to do a very short reading from that, and then with whatever time I have left, I'll conclude. But I want to start by mentioning that the 25 stories in this anthology are divided into 5 groups. And this was a characteristic of the Penguin Book of Japanese short stories that seemed to have worked well, and that I decided to undertake. And the first of the 5 categories is tradition. And I chose that category because at a time when Korean popular culture is driving, one might say, cultural production worldwide, it's important for all the people who are getting hooked on K this, K that, to realize that the Korean literary tradition, which should not be K literature, but it goes back thousands of years. And we need to understand, we need to remind one another that much of the oral and performance elements of Hallyu, the Korean wave, are based in Korean oral literature, Gubi Munhak. So the Korean literary tradition, the Hangul Junto, please don't say K Munhak, is something that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the continuity, the connections that survive to this day. A very, very rich literary tradition. And the very first story that we start off is one that Kim Jong-un and I translated. It's one of our favorite translations. It's the classic buckwheat story by Hyosŏk. And if any of you are ever in you might remember that I think it was the 2018 Winter Olympics were in Pyeongchang. That's where Hyosŏk is from. And it's in that general area where the buckwheat story takes place. And if you've ever been up there at the time of the year when the buckwheat is blooming, I think you will agree that Hyosŏk is not, he's not overstating the beauty of these flowers when they come into bloom, especially at nighttime when the moon is out. So it's a beautiful background for a story that involves inyan, a prior connection. But what I like about it is the emphasis on itinerancy. So in a class society such as Korea's, itinerancy was very, very important, especially in terms of entertainment and in terms of commerce. So those of you who are familiar with the Korean class system, Sanong Gong Sang, realize that Sang, the merchants, they're at the very bottom. So reflecting the Neo-Confucian aversion to, I guess, commercial gain. But I remember very well my first year in Korea in 1978. I lived in a small village in Jeollabuk-do, Jangsu-gun, and I lived with a family. And the family had 2 businesses, one of which was a shoe shop. And I remember every 5th day they would take out a selection of shoes to the Jangtol, and I remember going there a few times, and I remember that as Hyosŭk portrays the Jongnal in his story, it's a very festive occasion. It's an occasion that brings people together. That involves perhaps a little bit of partying afterwards, and I can imagine an old-time pansori presentation taking place on a Jongnal when everyone's already gathered together. So I think it's very important to realize that itinerancy plays, and I think in a sense continues to play an important part in Korean cultural life. Among the other stories in the tradition section is the one by Mr. Kim Tae-yong, Pig on Grass. And the tradition element there, it comes in kind of late in the story, but this story concerns an elderly man who is experiencing dementia, and to him, his good wife and their favorite pig are still living presences in his mind. But toward the end of the story, he has a visit from his son, who is a philosophy professor, and who reminds Dad, we're going abroad. I'm on sabbatical, and with the implication that father by himself cannot adequately take care of himself. And this, of course, is a major breach in tradition. The Changnam should be, first priority should be taking care of the parents. And I'm happy to announce this story, this translation was published in the Massachusetts Review, which has an annual translation award funded by a man named Chemetsky. It's a kind of a low profile, but a very important award from a very important literary and social journal in the US. And the translation was awarded that prize as well. I will transition now to the women and men section. And you notice I call it women and men, men and women. And the very first story in this is novella, actually. It's the classic Gubo story, Sosoga Guboy Iril, which Kevin considered to be the best, or this was his favorite story from the colonial period. And this story had been translated by Sun-Young Park, who teaches at the University of Southern California, with a collaborator, Jefferson J. Gatwa. And when the Asha Chupansa, about 10 years ago, decided to publish about 100 plus volumes of stories in bilingual editions, this translation was first published there. Kevin liked it so much that when it became a candidate for this volume, he assisted. He did some help with some fine tuning, which was very much appreciated by Sun-Young Park. So if those of you who are familiar with the story might recognize it as kind of a walk around Gyeongsan, of course, as Seoul was called back in those days, kind of seeing the sights, stopping at various tea houses, meeting a few friends, having hanjan here. But at the end of the story, the women and men, back home he goes. It's his mother who has high expectations of him, wants him to be getting married, and so forth. I also would like to mention that Yujång and I did a new translation of Kim Yujong's classic story, Tongbekgot, which I think has been translated 2 or 3 times under the title Camellias. Well, we have a camellia bush outside the window of our breakfast nook in Seattle, and I don't think Kim Yujong was talking about what we have outside our window. So we did a little bit of research, and it seems that a more accurate title for Tongbekgot would be Spice Bush Blossoms. And we kind of like that title because Jung-soon, who's the female interest in this story, is very spicy. So this is a classic coming of age story. I'd also like to mention the story by Chae-yoon, The Last of Hanako. This is a classic story, a kind of a subversive story that exposes, shall I say, the kind of the romanticization and myth making of young post university men. And at the end of the story, the takeaway from this story is what we might call Jung-che, identity. So Hanako is a name invented for her by the group of friends, both mostly male, some female, that she hangs out with from time to time. But by the end of the story, she's revealed by her bonmyeon, Chang Jinja, and I'm guessing the choice of Jin was intended by the author, meaning the true. We could understand that as the true one, the actual one. So this is where the title of the story is revealed. Hanako는 없다. As for Hanako, she's not there anymore. So, and then this also needs mention. The only one of the 25 contents that is not a short story or novella is a chapter from a novel by North Korean writer Hong Såkchung. Ji-chan and I first became familiar with this novel when it was released in a South Korean edition about 15 years ago. And at the time we were captivated by how well this author, one of many who has written about Hwang Chini, we immediately recognized the author's gift for storytelling, which should not be taken for granted in a literary culture that for some decades, as Marshall Peale did with some research into the Chosun Munhak Literary Journal in North Korea, had a very kind of strong prescription menu for how stories should be written, along with Kim Il-sung's reminder that anyone can be a writer if you fit this prescription. So for those of you who know something about modern Korean literary history, you might know that Hong Såkchung is the grandson of Hong Myung-hee. Hong Myung-hee, a colonial period writer and author of the 10-volume novel Im Gukjang. And I remember 15 or 20 years ago, I happened to be in Seoul. I was downtown. I went into the Kyobo Mungo, and a new edition of this novel came out. I picked it up, started reading it, and within a page or two, I said, wow, this guy can really write. So it's so nice. I speak of connections. It's so nice to see, in this case, a family connection. Hong Såkchung was awarded a Manhae Munhak Daesang about 20 years ago, a very important prize awarded in honor of the poet Han Young-won. Okay, and now we're on Suzanne, time check. 18. 8:10. Okay, I'm going to have to hurry up a little bit. The next section is Peace and War, and once again, I've reversed the sequence in recognition of the fact that the two Koreas are so technically in a state of war. Many of us hope that will not last forever. And among these stories is the one by Hwang Sun-won, an author whom Ju-chan had been translating for decades. And this is a rare Korean story that deals actually with the battlefield. Most Korean stories about the war deal with the after effects of the war. Enough of them have been written to earn a category of their own Chånghǔi so-so post-war fiction. Now we're getting to Hell Chosun. So I think this is a term that most of you have heard in recent years. I like to think again in terms of connections, and I would like to think that during the Chosun Kingdom, a lot of firstborn sons went through their own kind of Hell Chosun in basically forfeiting their childhood to master literary Chinese so that they could earn an all-important byeso in the Korean era, in the Korean administration. And among the first story in this section I should mention is a new translation of Isang's Nalge, classic Nalge story by Kevin O'Rourke. He really, really liked that story. I'm also happy to mention that there's a ghost story by Shin Kyung-suk and a story with environmental implications by Chesu Chol, and the story by Pyeon Hae-young, I am happy to acknowledge, was translated by a student of mine, a Taiwanese Canadian student named Cindy Chen, who's now practicing law in the state of Indiana. And I like to remind my students that literary translators and lawyers have something in common. They both take content and apply form to it. So, and in that context, the story in the Women and Men section by Chung Eun-young, Pano, or Needlework, was translated by another one of my UB students who is also practicing law. And most important among this section is Oh Jung-hee's story, Wayfarer. And I would like to invite Ms. O up here. We're going to do a very short reading from that story. So 5 minutes. Okay. This might be the end. So let me give you a little bit of background about this story. The story begins with a woman named Hae-ja who has come home. We don't immediately know where she came home from, but she has returned to a home that is empty. And she begins to try to recover the 2 years, I think, in which she has been away. And she starts off by calling her friends and gets the no one's here by that name, or you got the wrong number. And finally, she gets to meet someone and is invited to a meeting nearby. Anybody remember the Sky Lounge nearby? Is it Sky Lounge? Ajikdo? The Sky Lounge. Ajikdo, you see it? Oh, okay. I've been there. So, and next, she gets in touch with her mentor, a man named Min, and Hae-ja has a gift. She makes costumes for dolls that Min uses in performances, and she really has a passion. This is how she wants to rebuild her life. And she calls Min, who doesn't immediately recognize who she is, but afterwards goes through the obligatory greetings and so forth. And we thought we would read a short section on Hae-ja's rediscovery of the implements she was using one day in the summer, very warm. We learn this at the end of the story, while she was at work, a strange man suddenly appeared before her, and Hae-ja panicked. And that's what led to what happened in the story. But we're going to be reading from a short section in which Hae-ja rediscovers her artwork. Yeah.
번역된 순례자의 노래 중에서 일부분입니다. 해자는 다락으로 올라갔다. 작업장으로 쓰던 지하실이 섭쓰레기와 쓰지 않은 살림살이 따위로 세워져 자연스레 폐쇄되자 그곳에 있던 물건들을 커다란 트렁크에 넣어 다른 구석에 올려두었던 것이다. 트렁크에는 두텁게 먼지가 앉았고 쇠 장식은 노비스러웠으나 잠겨 있지는 않았다. 그녀가 넣어두었던 그대로 한 겹 신문지 아래 그것들은 고스란히 들어있었다. 묽고 가는 토막철사, 굳어버린 접착제 튜브, 물감들인 새의 깃털과 한 움큼의 소변걸, 얼굴뿐이 견우와 직녀, 만들다만 선녀의 나래옷, 그녀의 손에 의해 닫혀진 후 한 번도 열려본 적이 없었을 트렁크 속에서 새처럼 조용히 누워있는 그것들을 하나씩 들춰내며 그녀는 이상하게 가슴이 무너지는 듯한 슬픔을 느꼈다. 한꺼번에 쓸어 담은 듯 갖가지 인형의 머리와 팔다리, 옷감 자투리들을 들추자 또 한 겹 신문지가 나타났다. 그녀는 잠깐 눈을 감고 심호흡을 했다. 트렁크 맨 밑바닥에 감추어진 것, 그녀의 가슴 밑바닥에 돌처럼 단단히 자리 잡은 것이 무엇인지 그녀는 너무도 잘 알고 있다. 상기도 100년 동안의 깊은 잠에서 깨어나지 못한 아름다운 공주. 그녀가 마지막으로 완성한 작품이었다. 의상을 입히고 화려한 드레스에 주름을 펴기 위해 마지막 인두질을 할 때 그 사건이 일어났던 것이다. 떨리는 손으로 신문지를 벗겨내자 화관에 둘러싸인 풍성한 머리털을 자랑스럽게 흩뜨린 공주의 얼굴이 드러나고 몸체가 드러났다. 그리고 그녀는 화려한 의상의 곳곳에서 은긴 사슬토막처럼 금빛으로 반짝이는 좀벌레의 후물을 보았다.
선생님. Up to the loft she went, to the corner where she had moved the huge trunk in which she had packed her work things. Odds and ends now took up her former basement workshop. Thick dust coated the trunk. The ornamental lock had rusted, but it was open. And there, under a single sheet of newspaper, were her things, just as she had laid them. Sections of wire mesh of various thicknesses, tubes of hardened adhesive, dyed feathers, a handful of sparkle, the faces of the weaver girl and the herder boy, and the unfinished winged clothes of the fairy. Strangely, she felt pangs of sorrow as, one by one, she uncovered these items lying silently, like ash, in the trunk she herself had closed and no one had opened. And when she had brought them all into view, the heads, arms, and legs, the remnants of fabric for the various costumes, all of it swept haphazardly into the trunk, another layer of newspaper appeared. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew all too well what lay hidden there at the bottom, entrenched like a rock in the depths of her bosom. It was her last creation, the lovely princess, sunk deep in a century-long slumber from which she couldn't awaken. Haeja had dressed her, was ironing her gorgeous dress one last time, and then it had happened. With trembling hand, she removed the newspaper, and there was the face of the princess, lush hair streaming proudly through her coronet. There was her body, and there, in her gorgeous costume, like so many severed links of a chain, were the glittering, golden remains of moths. Okay, before we close, I'll just mention very briefly the last of the 5 sections of the book, Into the New World. I'm happy to acknowledge I stole this. This is the song title of one of my favorite Girls' Generation songs, but I think it describes the 6 stories in this section, progressive in terms of subject matter. If we'd had a little bit more time, I would have enjoyed reading from the start of the very last of 25 stories, our translation of Kim Il-sun's 2013 Isan prize-winning story, Chimug의 미래, in our translation of Future Sound. Very unusual story, but a perfect way to end this book. It's about endangered languages, and as Professor Kwon mentions at the end of his introduction, when these languages become extinct, a volume such as this is no longer possible. So, I always enjoy ample time for dialogue, questions and answers, brickbats, if I can dodge them. Allow me to make a couple of requests as a matter of courtesy to the other attendees. Please limit your questions to one at a time, one question. No political, ideological questions, please. And please keep your questions short. This, I know a lot of you probably like to talk as much as I do, but again, as a matter of courtesy to the other attendees, please keep your questions short. And this is a time for questions, okay? Not comments, not making a case about something. And I don't anticipate there being a shortage of questions, but if there were to be a shortage of questions, I have a couple of questions for you. Number one would be, what should the next Korean literature volume in the Penguin series be? I can provide half of an answer to that. The next volume, published by Penguin UK, will be in a new short form series they've begun, consists of about 25,000 words. And Jung-hee are very proud to say that that volume will be the best of Jung-hee, including a couple of her classic stories. But what should be next on the list? I'd be happy to take recommendations, make a wish list. Second, you remember that I mentioned the Penguin Book of Japanese short stories at the University of Washington. Well, I thought they could do a book talk on the Japanese one, they could do one on the Korean volume. But at least one of the members, or maybe more, of the Center for Korean Studies at UW decided that this wasn't worthy of a book launch because most of the translations had already been published. That doesn't make sense to me. This is, after all, a classic. But I'm kind of curious as to what your reaction would be to a collection of stories, a great majority of which have already been published. Okay, should I be the... Sir, excuse me, before you, I believe you were absent when I mentioned the guidelines for the stories, for the questions. So please hear me out first before you speak. As a matter of courtesy to the other attendees, please ask only one question. Okay. Please keep the question short, and this is a question, not a statement, and okay. Please no political content.
I very admire your passion and enthusiasm.
감사합니다.
I've collected a couple of books of yours with them. You know, can I ask a question, the general question, aside from these stories?
Please.
Well, I used to attend a couple of conferences, which was organized by the ATI, not the one, but then there's one gave grants, you also did that. So when it comes down to promotion of literature, I hate to say, we Koreans too bad really. We want to export literature, promote, but I think the marketing, book marketing, is undoubtedly important, indispensable. And when it comes down to it, I hate to, criticize them, but the production is very good for the last, I think, 20 years, right? They have been busily producing lot of books, not only novels and poetry. That's very good, but the production is also very good. However, marketing, publication, it's not so, good enough. So what's your idea to promote the book marketing to create the awareness of a global audience?
Okay, thank you for that question. I'm afraid the answer I'm providing may not to be to your satisfaction, but I'm old-fashioned.
So if it's in that sense, the Penguin publication is excellent.
Yes, oh, of course, yeah. When Yujång and I started translation almost 45 years ago, we translated because we felt in almost all the cases that the authors and the stories we're translating deserved an English language audience. We did not decide to become working translators as the many members of the younger generation style themselves. We don't translate by Chungtak. We don't translate because somebody asked us to. We translate authors and works that we think are important, that will survive as works of English language literature. And we take an active role in publicizing our translations. We give book talks, we do readings. Fortunately, the United States has a very strong tradition of readings at bookstores. I've also been fortunate to be able to do readings, talk about our translations at universities. But for much of the very short history of Korean to English literary translation, the market has been the university classroom, and the publishers have usually been university presses or small presses. That's changing now. The Banyawan is targeting larger presses. They're engaging in what I call a kind of vanity publishing. Basically, they'll pick out a publisher and say, okay, we'll give you $1 million or $1.5 million if you translate these books. And my understanding is that several of the translations that get published have been collecting dust, the Bunyip one. So I think the commercialization of publication of translations of literature is inevitable. The same thing I think happened with modern contemporary Japanese fiction. I don't like it though. Why? Because back in the old days, when Yujång and I started out, it was just us and the author. And we made a deal. We are partners, half-half, all like that. But now we've got these literary agents who are necessarily involved primarily with money, with proceeds for the author. We have now Jojak-won representatives at the major publishers in Korea, Changbi, Munji, Minamsa, Munak Tongne, and so forth. And of course, we have the Banyaek-won, but also the Daesan Foundation. And as you mentioned very appropriately, their approach is what we would call a push approach. This is what foreign readers need to read. But more properly, shouldn't there be some kind of pull aspect? What would you like to see? What works have succeeded in your classroom? And of course, what works have sold commercially? That's a reasonable question, but it's not why we're involved in translation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is your 1983 translation of Debasement still in print? And if not, do you have any related copies that you'd like to get rid of?
Well, it is. Professor Lee Sung-bin was kind enough to devote some time to it in a afternoon conference at Chŏnghǔi last week, and we kind of cringed when we saw that. Yes, it is in print. We may have a copy at home in Seattle. So the next time you're there, but that's very much a translation we would like to return. If there was ever a possibility for us to do a new version of that, I think we would. Fortunately, our first translation of a novel by Hwang Chini, which was a few years later, by then I had kind of a basic reading knowledge of Korean, which I didn't in the Seoul collection. 30 years later, we found that translation not to be to our satisfaction, but we're fortunate enough to do a new translation of that. This was his novel 움직이는 성, which we titled as The Moving Castle. No, they're not castles in Korea, they're fortress walls. So the new translation was The Moving Fortress. But yeah, I think there are a few copies still in circulation. Yes.
I appreciate it. She has her life.
As you see, Korean is very delicate things. So it has very complicated atmosphere in one sentence.
Mhm.
So what is your attraction to deliver a very original atmosphere in the audience or translating so well done?
Good question. So what I always emphasize to my students, and it's something that Yujång and I attempt to do, is to inhabit the Korean work. And I must mention that I got this concept of a denizen, that is an inhabitant, from what's his name? He's a translation studies scholar, Michael Conlon, at Trinity College in Dublin, University of Dublin. So what Michael Conlon means by denizen is being part of the story, seeing what the author is visualizing for us, hearing the conversation, and especially if you're dealing with an author like Chŏnghǔi, who had a very distinctive conversational style, and also Wanså for that matter, to smell what's being smelled, to feel what's going on. And the feeling part helps us, I think, to convey the 분위기, the atmosphere. But we have to remember, our authors are very diverse in their 문체, their literary style. What we prefer is an author with a distinct literary style, with compelling subject matter, but with an appropriate narrative to go with it. I could give you some examples, but if you combine the compelling subject matter with an appropriate narrative style, and if you're fortunate to have an author like Ms. O, who is very, very particular, very detailed about her writing. I like to remind people that when her first story collection came out in 1977, it includes stories from almost a decade. That is almost one story per year. First one was 1969. And I'm proud to say that Ms. O continues to write. In recent decades, she's been specializing on a genre, conte, which is a kind of a short form story, anecdotal. And some of the pieces are brilliant. We've translated several of them, as have my students. And there's something else I forgot to mention. Are any of you familiar with the Modern Language Association, the MLA in New York City? It's one of the most prominent language and literature scholarly associations in the world. I didn't realize this, but maybe this is a recent introduction to their program, but they have a list of honorary fellows. And I'm very happy, I learned this only last year, that Ms. Oh last year became the first Korean writer to be elected unanimously as a lifetime fellow of the Modern Literature Association. And among the other 2 or 3 writers who earned that honor was the Japanese Nobel Prize laureate Oe Kenzaburo. So this is the level at which Ms. O operates. Very detailed, very concerned about what she's writing. So we're very fortunate that she is active at a time when most other writers are not.
Yeah. It's a short question. I wonder whether there is any other Asian language books published by Penguin Book Classics, in addition to Japanese and Chinese.
Is there a Chinese volume of Chinese, Penguin Book of Chinese short stories?
There is I don't think I haven't seen other languages other than Japanese.
Well, we've seen some European languages, right? Yeah.
There's one in Bengali that just came out.
Bengali?
Yeah, by Aeran.
Wow.
That came out maybe a month ago.
Wow.
Similar hardback.
Yeah, right. The first, and I should, what I'm holding is the Penguin UK paper edition, which came out at the end of April. In December, there will be a Penguin USA paperback edition coming out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Professor. Little bit of a subjective question.
Oh, here we are.
Curious, someone new to Korean lit. How you think some of these stories stack up against other stories in the arena of world lit? In other words, let's say 50 years from now, if someone was making an anthology of the best world lit short stories, would any of some of these be considered? If that doesn't merit an answer, then perhaps.
Oh, well, yes, it very much merits an answer. I wish I could give you one. I've always liked short fiction. I remember the first and last 9-to-5 job I ever had lasted 13 months until I got fired, but was at a publishing company called Prentice Hall on the banks of the Hudson River, just north of New York City. And for during my lunch break, I'd take a short story collection out and read a story. But in recent decades, I have to confess my reading of short fiction, other than Korean short fiction, has been very sparse. I suppose I could blame my late father for that. About 25 years ago, he said, and he was familiar with our translations. He said, you should start reading mysteries, and that will help you learn pacing and conversation, dialogue. And he was right. Fortunately, what it also brought me in the right mystery writers I began to focus on, a very strong sense of place, very strong sense of culture. And that reminded me of how important it is. Not all Korean stories have a strong sense of place. More recently, we're seeing some stories set outside of Korea. This is very unusual still. But back to the question of 50 years from now, how many of these stories are going to stand the test of time? I'd like to think that maybe half would. And I say this on the basis of a translation we did of the classic Chemanchik story, Chisuk. Our translation is in a collection that Professor Gwon and I put together for Columbia University Press 20 years ago. The title of our translation is My Innocent Uncle. And that ended up, that was the first Korean work to appear in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. It was about 8 to 10 years ago. Stories in the present volume, I think the Hanako story, the story by Yujoo, the last story, the first story, the buckwheat story. Oh, and I should also mention the story by Hwang Chini, Pya Doduk. This is a still somewhat unusual story of a same-sex relationship. We're starting to see a lot more LGBTQ fiction being translated, but this was a very, very compelling story, and it proved compelling to literary magazines. It's the only story that we've submitted that was immediately accepted by both the Massachusetts Review, which I mentioned earlier, and by Two Lines, which is a literary journal published by Two Lines Press, which is part of the Center for Art and Translation in the Bay Area, and they publish only literary translation. So this is a story that I'm positive will stand the test of time.
Well, Professor.
Hi.
I'm relatively new to Korean literature. So I read Kim Jong-un for in 1982, The Vegetarian a couple months ago, and I was sort of blown away by this contemporary Korean literature that's not really well represented in K-pop or K-drama. So you asked what I'd like to see in the new anthology, and I would love just contemporary Korean life stories. That's the kind of genre I'm interested in.
Well, good, because that's what we're focusing on now. It's become more and more difficult for us to get publishers of our novels, because more and more publishers have decided they don't want to deal with translators without agents. But I need to remind you that The Vegetarian is not, it's about Korean literature, but it's not a translation, for one thing. It's an adaptation. It's basically a British woman who is she's very good at English language writing, decided, and there have been a couple of academic presentations about this, one by a former MA student of mine at UBC. Basically, this is a kind of my take on the Korean title is Chesik Juija. It's a linked story novel consisting of 3 novellas. So the English version has attracted a lot of readers, but we should remember that that's not. We need to distinguish between the Hong Kong stories Chesik Juija and the British version. But I'm glad to know that that contemporary issues work for you. I think you'll like The Bone Thief. I think you'll like the story by Jung Young-moon. I haven't mentioned that yet, but Jung Young-moon uses a kind of stream of consciousness style where nothing much really. There's not much what you might call a wow moment that you come across, but it's all about kind of what he's thinking, and he's pretty good at it. Jung Young-moon.
We have time for just one more question.
And what did you make this about the correct relationship, which is such as
Oh. Yeah, who's the author of that?
I'd like to die, or I'd like to put this kind of very sincere non-fiction, it's a very Korean art. And you, that's where you potential towards violence.
Well, I think any publications that attract a readership in Korea, especially if they're print matter, and I say this because if any of you have any kind of a history of riding the subways in Seoul, you'll know that there was a very strong reading culture on the subways, either newspapers, books. Now, if you take a subway ride, and I sometimes do this, I count the number of people who are reading print material, and there may be 2 or 3 in a car, maybe 100 people, and you know what the other 98 or 99% are doing. And one of our authors, Jung-hee, in a recent novel of his, cited a survey in which adult readers were asked how much time they spent per week reading print materials of any kind, literature, and the answer, or the average, was 27 minutes a week. Now, if this is true, this suggests that Korean literature may be overshadowed, maybe eclipsed by the elements of Korean popular culture, which is why I think it's so important that we keep, I mentioned Jung-hee identity, that Korea has a very old literary tradition, and I would like to think that some of that still surfaces in very contemporary writing. It's pretty much a stereotype of modern Korean fiction that many people find it, both in Korea and beyond, kind of gloomy, ulhae. And I'm happy to say that some of the stories that are in the Penguin anthology have little bits of humor here and there, enough, I think, to remind people that if you can develop a little sense of empathy and try to understand what's been going on, that might help. That might help bring these works, make them a little bit more relatable. But yes, I think authors who are gifted at dialogue, authors who are visual, probably have the best chance of succeeding. But again, Yujång, he's very opinionated, but he deserves to be. He's 80 years old. He's still writing. He should have gotten the Nobel Prize by now. But he says that Korean authors these days are incapable of writing a third-person narrative. So most of what we read now is first-person, interior landscape. Thank you very much for your questions.